14:23 hours. A detention facility near Lüneburg, northern Germany. Rain hammers against the corrugated roof like machine gun fire fading into memory. Greta Müller stands in line, soaked, silent, and waiting for punishment. Her Wehrmacht auxiliary uniform clings to her skin, the insignia smeared with mud and defeat. For years, propaganda had told her what to expect. That the British were decadent, weak, cruel to prisoners. That surrender meant humiliation, maybe worse. Across the room, a British sergeant sits behind a desk, filling out a ledger with the calm precision of a man counting invoices, not prisoners. When her turn comes, he looks up, not with anger, but curiosity. "Name?" he asks through an interpreter. Greta gives it, braced for the slap, the shove, the sneer she's been warned about. Instead, he pushes a tin cup across the table. Steam rises from it. "Tea," he says in broken German. "You'll want to sit. Processing takes time." Greta freezes. The cup is warm in her hands. Real tea, not the bitter bark substitutes they'd drunk for 2 years. It's absurd, impossible. She doesn't understand. She doesn't understand anything anymore. Because in that moment, standing in a rain-soaked prison camp, holding a British cup of tea, Greta Müller realizes the Reich might have lied about everything. You're about to hear a story that challenges everything we think we know about war, about enemies, vengeance, and what it means to truly win. A story where the might of the British Empire wasn't measured in bombs or rifles, but in restraint. Where a single act of decency cracked the armor of an entire ideology. Because sometimes, the strongest weapon isn't fired. It's poured quietly into a tin cup. The war was over, but for Greta Müller, it didn't feel that way. Germany had fallen apart like wet paper. Cities in ruins, trains silent, families vanished. And now, this captured by the very people she'd been taught to fear. She'd served as a Wehrmachthelferin, a communications clerk, not a combatant, but still part of the machine. By the spring of 1945, more than 500,000 German women had done the same. Telephone operators, clerks, typists, anti-aircraft spotters. They wore uniforms. They followed orders. They believed in victory until there was none left to believe in. When British troops surrounded and captured her unit near Lüneburg, Greta expected retribution. She expected to be spat on, starved, or worse. Instead, she was given tea. And not just tea. A medical exam, gentle, careful, methodical. A nurse who spoke softly, who stopped when Greta flinched, who said, "I won't hurt you." The words made no sense. The enemy wasn't supposed to care if you hurt, but she did. The British weren't improvising this kindness. It was policy. The Geneva Convention of 1929 demanded humane treatments for prisoners, and the British took that seriously, not as formality, but as principle. They fed their captives. They provided shelter, blankets, clean water. They even brought in the Red Cross to monitor every facility. By 1946, Britain held nearly 400,000 German prisoners, men and women. Fewer died in British custody than under any other Allied power. To Greta, it was more disorienting than punishment could have been. The camp she entered wasn't a place of vengeance, it was a machine of order. Tents replaced by converted barracks. Wool blankets folded neatly at the foot of metal bunks. Morning routines run with quiet precision. Roll call, breakfast, assignments. Not luxury, not comfort, but humanity. Greta was assigned to the administrative office, sorting papers, translating, typing up reports. Her British supervisor, Lieutenant Hargreaves, was the embodiment of calm efficiency. No shouting. No contempt. Just instructions, delivered with the same tone he'd use for any clerk, anywhere. Once, she made a filing error, an entire folder misplaced. She froze, waiting for the outburst. Hargreaves sighed, retrieved the file, and handed it back. "Try again," he said simply. "Happens to everyone." That was it. No yelling, no threat, just patience. For Greta, it was more shocking than anger could have been. Every small kindness, a clean bandage, a cup of milk, a calm voice stripped away another layer of the lies she'd been raised on. Lies that painted the British as decadent, cowardly, cruel. But the reality in that camp was the opposite: discipline, decency, restraint. And that restraint, though no one said it aloud, was deliberate. The British understood something the Germans had forgotten, that how you treat your enemies defines who you are. Yet beneath the civility, Greta felt something else brewing: confusion, guilt, disbelief. Because the people who had destroyed her homeland were now treating her better than her own side ever had, and soon, that quiet kindness would begin. To do what no battlefield ever could, it would change her. Mornings began with a bell, 6:30 sharp. The women rose, made their beds with military precision, and lined up for breakfast in a communal hall that smelled faintly of soap and porridge. Porridge. Real porridge. Not the thin beet pulp they'd scraped from bowls during the final months of the war. Bread, jam, powdered milk. It wasn't much, but it was consistent, and after years of scarcity, consistency itself felt like luxury. Greta still couldn't trust it. Each morning she waited for the punishment to come, for the British to reveal some hidden cruelty. But the cruelty never came. The guards were polite but distant, the routines predictable. And that predictability unnerved her more than chaos ever had. Greta's work assignment in the administrative office became her quiet refuge. There, among stacks of papers and dull pencils, she began to observe something she hadn't seen in years' normalcy. British officers bickering over logistics, clerks complaining about rain, food, or boredom. They weren't monsters, just men doing their jobs. It was during one of those long, gray afternoons that she first noticed Private Davies, a tall Yorkshireman with a cigarette always hanging from his lip. He guarded the outer fence, lazy posture, soft eyes. He was, in every way, the opposite of what German propaganda had promised. One evening, as the sun bled through low clouds, Greta walked to the wire. She didn't know why, curiosity. Maybe. Davies looked up. "Evening," he said. She hesitated, searching for words in broken English. "Why are you kind?" she asked. He frowned, exhaled smoke. "Why wouldn't we be?" She gestured to her uniform. "We are enemy." Davies shrugged. "War's over, innit? You're just people now. Just people." It was the simplest thing anyone had ever said to her, and the most dangerous, because it planted a question that began to eat at her. If the enemy can see us as human, what does that make everything we believed? Weeks later, Greta was assigned to a nearby farm in Hampshire, a labor program helping rebuild Britain's food supply. She expected field guards and scorn. Instead, she met the Waywrights, an older couple who'd lost their son at Arnhem. Mrs. Waywright had calloused hands, sharp eyes, and a tone that tolerated no laziness. "Know how to milk a cow?" she asked. "No, ma'am. You'll learn. Come on." The work was grueling: 6 cows, 2 sessions a day, mud up to her ankles. But at noon, the bell rang, and lunch was ready. Cheese sandwiches, pickles, a pot of strong tea. Greta hesitated at the door, unsure if the meal was for her. Mrs. Waywright noticed. "Sit," she ordered. Greta sat. Across the table, Mr. Waywright finally spoke. "Lost our son at Arnhem," he said quietly. Greta's heart stopped. Arnhem, the paratrooper battle. She swallowed hard. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He nodded, slowly. "Wasn't your fault. Wasn't ours either. Just the bloody war." The words struck like shrapnel, blunt, final, impossible to argue with. That night, back in her cot, Greta couldn't sleep. She tried to summon hatred for them, the British, the ones who had bombed her cities, burned her country. But the hate wouldn't come. She tried to feel pride in the Reich, but found only ash. And in that quiet moment of confusion, the real war began. Not the one fought with guns, but the one fought inside her mind, between what she'd been taught and what she was seeing with her own eyes. The British had won the battlefield, months ago. But now, through small acts of mercy, they were winning something even greater, her belief. And soon, they would show her something she could never unsee. September 1945. The guards announced a mandatory screening. No explanation, no details, just a notice pinned outside the women's barracks. All auxiliaries report to Recreation Hall, 1900 hours. Greta expected another propaganda film. She'd seen dozens grainy newsreels about glorious victories that never happened, smiling officers shaking Hitler's hand, the Reich eternal and invincible. But what flickered onto that white canvas that night wasn't glory. It was hell. The lights dimmed, the projector rattled to life, and the first image filled the screen a field of corpses. Skeletal, twisted, unrecognizable. The camera panned to a sign, Bergen-Belsen, then to another, Dachau, gas chambers, open pits, bodies stacked like firewood. Faces so hollow they barely looked human. Greta couldn't move. Her fingers dug into her knees. Around her, someone gasped. Another whispered 9, 9, shaking her head, refusing to believe. The film kept rolling. British soldiers walking through camps, silent, handing food to the dying. Doctors in masks, disinfecting barracks crawling with disease. Children, just skin and eyes staring blankly into the lens. It went on for what felt like hours, and when the lights came up, no one spoke. A British officer stepped forward. "This," he said quietly, "is what you served." He let the words hang there. Not all of you knew, but all of you enabled it. The silence was unbearable. In the corner, Ursula, a former radio operator, stood up, trembling. "That's fake," she insisted. "British propaganda. They want us ashamed." Helga, seated 2 rows away, snapped through tears. "My cousin worked near Dachau. She told me things I didn't want to believe." "You still don't?" Ursula shouted back. "We were following orders. What choice did we have?" Greta turned slowly, her voice low but steady. "We had a choice," she said. "We chose not to ask questions." The room fell still, because everyone knew she was right. They had chosen silence, comfort over conscience, obedience over truth. And now the truth was staring back at them, filmed by the very people they'd been told were monsters. Later that night, Greta sat on her bunk, shaking. The images wouldn't leave her. The sound of flies, the blank eyes of the dead. She had believed in a Germany of honor and discipline, but the British had shown her what that discipline had built. What haunted her most wasn't the horror itself, it was the realization that the enemy had to teach her compassion. For the first time, Greta understood the war hadn't ended. It had simply moved from the fields of Europe to the conscience of those who'd survived. And for the women in that hall, there was no defense left, only the beginning of an unbearable reckoning. But what came after was something no one on either side expected. By 1947, Europe was rebuilding, and so were its people. The guns had gone silent, but the work of peace had only just begun. Across Britain, fields needed workers, factories needed hands, and towns needed rebuilding. The war had emptied villages of Blows, men. So now, the irony was sharp. Former enemies were being asked to help restore the very nation they once tried to destroy. Restrictions eased. Uniforms were replaced with plain gray dresses. Watchtowers still stood, but the gates opened more often. Greta, once a number in a ledger, was now Miss Müller again, a foreign worker, on official papers. She returned to the Waywrights' farm, where she was met with something that looked suspiciously like trust. Mrs. Waywright handed her a key to the barn. "Don't lose it," she said. That was all. No guard followed, no eyes watching her every step. It shouldn't have felt revolutionary, but it did. Freedom, even in small doses, was intoxicating. At night, Greta joined the other women in quiet conversations about home, or what was left of it. Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, all cities of ghosts. The letters they received from Germany spoke of rubble, hunger, and a people too numb to feel shame. Britain, for all its rationing and scars, suddenly felt whole. And the women, once prisoners, were helping to feed it. In the administrative office, Greta began to notice something else. Thomas, a British sergeant with ink-stained fingers and a dry sense of humor. He was the kind who never raised his voice. When she translated German documents, he'd correct her English gently, never mockingly. One afternoon, while filing records, he asked, "What will you do after?" Greta hesitated. "Go back to Germany, I suppose." He looked at her. To what? She had no answer. Her parents were gone, her home reduced to ashes. Thomas nodded slowly, as if he understood. "There are resettlement programs," he said, "if you wanted to stay." She looked at him, startled. Stay? In the country that had defeated her, among the people she was taught to hate. Why not? But the reasons not to came rushing back, the propaganda, the guilt, the whispers of betrayal. Yet beneath all of it, something gentler was growing: respect. By late summer, newspapers quietly began reporting something extraordinary. Hundreds of marriages between German prisoners and British citizens. 796 of them by the year's end. Love born out of captivity. Friendship forged from discipline, not pity. Greta never crossed that line. Regulations still forbade fraternization, but she understood now how it could happen. Because in Thomas's careful tone, in Davies's casual kindness, in Mrs. Wayright's weary patience, she saw something she'd never been shown by the Reich: the power of mercy. The British had won without humiliation, ruled without cruelty, and punished without hatred. And that quiet moral victory was reshaping Europe, one small human gesture at a time. For Greta, the war was no longer about flags or borders. It was about people. And she was beginning to realize that the people she'd been told to fear might be the very ones who could teach her how to live again. But her final lesson, the one that would stay with her for life, was still waiting in the mirror. October 1946, 17 months since her capture. The woman staring back at Greta Müller from the mirror hardly looked like the one who'd arrived. Her face had color again. Her eyes no longer darted like a hunted animal's. The hollowness had been replaced with something unfamiliar peace. Behind her, Helga combed her hair. Ursula was humming quietly as she washed her face. Ordinary sounds, ordinary gestures. A luxury they hadn't known in years. The barracks that had once felt like a cage now felt like shelter. The guards, once symbols of fear, now nodded politely in greeting. And Greta couldn't stop thinking about it. The British, her supposed enemies, had done what her own nation never did. They'd fed her, healed her, given her structure, dignity, routine. But most of all, they had refused to become what they fought. She thought back to the speeches she'd once cheered, for the ones about British weakness, about Aryan strength, about destiny. Now, standing in that mirror, she realized the truth. The strongest thing Britain ever did was nothing. They didn't humiliate. They didn't avenge. They simply restrained. That restraint, that refusal to descend into cruelty, was more devastating to Nazi ideology than any bomb ever dropped on Berlin. Later that evening, Greta walked outside. The sky was washed in autumn gold. Private Davies was leaning against the fence again, smoking his usual cigarette. She approached, her heart oddly heavy. "Private Davies," she said softly. He looked over. Thank you," he frowned. "For what?" "For treating us like people." Davies blinked, embarrassed. He flicked his cigarette away. "Just doing my job, love." But Greta knew better. It wasn't just a job. It was a choice. Every small act, the cup of tea, the clean bandage, the calm tone, had been a choice. And those choices had defeated an empire's propaganda. In a world obsessed with power, the British had quietly proven something profound. True power is restraint. To conquer hate not by reflecting it, but by refusing it. Greta stood there for a long time, watching the smoke curl into the gray English sky. For the first time, she wasn't thinking like a prisoner or a patriot. She was just human. The war that had defined her life was finally over, not because someone signed a treaty, but because she'd seen mercy, and it had broken her chains far more completely than any weapon ever could. But one last moment years later would etch that lesson forever. 1962. 17 years after the war. A quiet kitchen in Hampshire. The rain taps gently against the window, almost the same sound Greta remembers from that first day in captivity. Her daughter, a curious girl of 10, sits at the table with a pencil and notebook. "Mama," she asks, "were you scared when they captured you?" Greta sets down her teacup, thinking. "Yes," she says, "but not for the reasons you think." Her daughter tilts her head. "I wasn't scared of what they'd do to me," Greta says softly. "I was scared because they were kind." The girl frowns. "Why is that scary?" Greta smiles faintly. "Because kindness from an enemy makes you question everything you were taught to believe." She pours her daughter a cup of tea, real tea, strong and dark, and slides it across the table. "Remember this," she says. "How people treat you when they don't have to, that's who they really are." Her daughter nods, not yet understanding. But someday, she will. Outside, the English countryside glows with autumn light. Greta looks out the window and remembers the Waywrights, Lieutenant Hargreaves, Private Davies, Thomas, the ones who'd chosen compassion when cruelty would have been easier. They hadn't just rebuilt Britain, they'd rebuilt her faith in humanity. And she realizes that the true legacy of the war wasn't who conquered whom, but who, in the aftermath, refused to become a conqueror. The cup of tea she'd been offered in 1945 hadn't been a gesture of pity. It had been a declaration that civilization doesn't end when the guns fall silent. It begins there. If this story challenged something you thought you knew about war, or about victory, hit that subscribe button. Because the battles worth remembering aren't the ones fought with weapons, but the ones fought with conscience. The cup of tea Greta held that first day wasn't just a drink. It was a weapon, the kind that doesn't wound, but heals, and in the end, it won.